Okay, so get this. Have you ever, noticed how when you learn something new, it just suddenly pops up everywhere?
Yeah, it's pretty common.
It's kind of freaky, right? It's like the
Ah,
universe is sending you a message or something.
right.
We're going to dive into that today. That feeling, it's called the Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon.
It
Yeah.
is.
So it's basically that feeling that something is happening more often, but just because you've become aware of it.
Exactly.
Totally. Just last week, I learned this word. Have you ever heard of the word petrichor?
I have heard that word before, yeah.
It's that, that earthy smell after it rains.
Oh, yeah.
And then bam, like every article I read, every podcast I listened to, it was like that word was following me around.
It is a cool word.
It is a cool word, but it was so weird. So why do you think our brains do that?
Well, it's not that the smell or the word became more common, it's that your brain just flagged it as important and started paying more attention.
Oh, okay. So it's not like a mystical sign from the universe.
Well,
Bummer.
it is kind of a brain trick. It's called the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. So it's a cognitive bias where we think things are happening more often, but really we're just noticing them more.
Okay. So cognitive bias. So it's like an error in thinking. Like my brain is kind of messing with me.
Yeah. In a way, yes. Think of it like this. Our brains are just bombarded with information constantly. And to avoid overload, they have to filter things,
Yeah.
right? They focus on what seems important at the time. So when you learn something new, your brain kind of puts a spotlight on it.
Okay, that makes sense. It's kind of like when you buy a new car and suddenly you see that same car everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's not that everyone rushed out and bought the same car. It's just that you're like hyper aware of it now.
Exactly. That's called selective attention.
Selective attention.
And it's also tied to another little brain quirk, we'll call it that. It's called confirmation bias, which is we tend to seek out information that confirms what we already believe.
Yeah.
So we might notice this new thing more because we're subconsciously looking for it.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, so we're filtering information and then we're going and looking for evidence to back up what we think we know.
Right.
It's a vicious cycle. What are some other examples of this?
Well, there's a classic example in medicine. So imagine a doctor who has just learned about a rare disease. Suddenly, they diagnose two cases in 24 hours. And it's not that the disease suddenly became more common, it's that the doctor is now attuned to those signs and symptoms.
Wow. I hadn't thought of it that way. So Baader-Meinhof can actually be helpful in a way.
It can. That focused attention can lead to important discoveries or insights, but like most things, it can also have a flip side.
Oh, okay. So what? Give me an example.
Sure. So you remember COVID toes?
COVID toes.
Early in the pandemic, doctors noticed more patients with swollen toes.
Right.
And some of those patients also had COVID. And so they thought, oh, this is a new COVID symptom, COVID toes. But later research actually disproved that link.
So they were basically, their brains were primed to see COVID symptoms everywhere.
Right.
And so they made a connection that wasn't really there.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how this bias can really warp our perception. And it's, basically we tend to overestimate the frequency of things we've just learned about,
So it's like our brains are saying, see, I told you it was everywhere.
pretty much.
Okay, that's kind of hilarious and kind of scary at the same time. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know is just, our brains playing tricks on us.
That is a great question.
That is a great question to consider. This is blowing my mind a little bit. So this whole Baader-Meinhof thing, where did that name even come from?
Well, it's named after a 1970s German terrorist group,
Oh, wow.
the Baader-Meinhof group.
Okay.
And someone had just learned about them for the first time and then just kept seeing their name pop up everywhere.
Wait, seriously? The phenomenon is named after, some random person's experience with a terrorist group.
It is.
That's wild.
Yeah, it is kind of a funny origin story.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. Okay, that's hilarious and also kind of mind-blowing at the same time. So we've established this thing is real.
Yeah,
It has a super quirky name.
it does.
And it can be both helpful and, totally misleading.
Right.
But for, our listener out there, what does this all mean for them? Why should they care about the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon?
Well, I think being aware of this bias can help us all be more critical thinkers in everything we do.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah.
We're constantly flooded with information, especially these days,
Right.
It's very easy to get kind of swept up in trends
So do I.
or jump to conclusions based on, just a few things that we see,
Especially with social media and, the news cycle being what it is,
right?
it feels like we're drowning in information overload constantly.
Yeah.
So how can we use this knowledge about Baader-Meinhof to kind of like navigate that?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it's a reminder to take a step back and ask ourselves, am I really seeing a pattern here, or is this just my brain highlighting something because it's new and shiny?
So it's like a mental check.
Yeah.
Like before I get all carried away with like some new idea or some new trend, I need to like pause and say,
Mhm.
is this really as big a deal as it seems?
Exactly. It's about cultivating healthy skepticism,
Okay.
which is super important, I think, when we're making decisions or forming opinions, especially about important things.
Man, this is like making me rethink how I process information now.
Yeah,
I'm starting to see like Baader-Meinhof everywhere.
right.
Like even as we're talking about it, I bet our listeners are noticing it more too.
I wouldn't be surprised. It's one of those things that once you're aware of it, you
Yeah.
start to see it everywhere.
That's true.
But that's a good thing.
It is. It is.
The more aware we are of our own biases, the better we can think critically and make informed choices.
I love that.
Yeah.
So to sum it all up, I think the big takeaway here
Yeah.
is don't always trust your brain at face value.
Right. It's trying to be helpful, but sometimes those shortcuts can lead to dead ends.
Be curious.
Yeah.
Question your assumptions.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to like dig a little deeper
Right.
before you fully buy into something.
That's a great way to put it.
Oh, thanks.
Curiosity and healthy skepticism.
Yeah,
Those are essential tools for navigating all this information out there.
I agree.
And Baader-Meinhof is a perfect example of how our brains can, subtly shape our reality.
Yeah, and that's so true.
And understanding that can empower us to be more discerning consumers of information.
I love that. This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
Good.
Thanks for like breaking down this fascinating brain quirk with us.
My pleasure. It's always fun to talk about these things.
And for our listeners, we'll leave you with a final thought to kind of chew on.
Okay.
Now that you know about the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon,
Right.
how might it change the way you see the world around you?
That's a good question.
What patterns or trends have you noticed that might just be your brain playing tricks on you? Let us know.
We'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious. I know I'm going to be like second guessing myself now
Yeah.
every time I see a pattern,
Yeah.
but like in a good way.
In a good way.
It's a good reminder to not just take things at face value,
Exactly. It's like having a superpower, the
Yeah.
ability to see through those illusions
I like the way you think.
our brains create.
Okay, so to wrap this whole thing up,
Okay.
I think the key message here is don't always trust your brain at face value.
Right.
Trying to be helpful, but like sometimes those mental shortcuts, they lead to dead ends.
They do.
So be curious.
Yeah,
Question your assumptions.
absolutely.
Don't be afraid to like dig a little deeper before you fully buy into something.
That's a great way to put it.
Oh, thanks.
Curiosity and that healthy skepticism are
Yeah.
so essential for navigating all this information out there.
I agree.
Baader-Meinhof is a perfect example of how our brains can, subtly shape our reality.
It's true.
And understanding that can empower us to be more discerning consumers of information.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
Good.
I've learned a lot.
Glad to hear it.
Thanks for shedding light on this fascinating, like, cognitive quirk.
My pleasure. Always fun to talk about this stuff.
And for our listeners out there, we'll leave you with a final thought to ponder, okay?
Okay.
Now that you know about the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, how might it change the way you interpret the world around you? What patterns or trends have you noticed that might just be your brain playing tricks on you?
Yeah.
Let us know. We'd love to hear from you.
We would.
Until next time, keep diving deep and stay curious.
Bye.